Welcome to the Albert Wolters Distinguished Visiting Professor Public Lecture for 2021. My name is Robert van der Noort and I'm the Vice Chancellor of the University of Reading, and it is my honor to specifically welcome Professor Alison Gopnik, who is our guest speaker for tonight. Professor Kamel Houston-Price will properly introduce Professor Gopnik in a moment, but for me just to welcome you all and say a few things why we're having our evening tonight. So I also want to extend welcome to colleagues, to students, to alumni and all friends of the university here and far away. Now tonight this is the third event this week where we celebrate the 100 years psychology at Reading. And you can find more events if you wish. You can try just Google Reading Psychology Centenary and you will find the relevant website with all the events that are taking place this week. Now, psychology was a discipline here before the university received its full independent status, and that's why psychology can celebrate its centenary 5 years before the university can. And I would like to say, you know, wait till I'm older than you, but I'm never going to catch up, really, am I? Now, Albert Wolters was initially a one-man show. He taught the whole program by himself. We remember him really as the founding head of psychology at the University of Reading. Now, in those 100 years, psychology has grown, both in size but also in stature. And it is now part of the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences. This school teaches over 3,000 students and includes over 200 staff, which includes more than 60 psychology academics. Now, I don't have to tell you, but psychology is a subject of critical importance to society now and in the future. For example, psychology supports our well-being in a time of change. And COVID is a change, is a period of faster change than we probably have known ever before. Psychology here at the University of Reading also engages extensively with the local community. It is part of an engaged university, which we are trying to achieve as part of our strategy. So, for example, it runs the Andy Research Clinic, the Anxiety and Depression in Children and Young People Clinic. It provides speech and language therapy clinics, and it hosts the famous Charlie Waller Institute, which helps upskills health professionals working in the NHS. And the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences also collaborates extensively with local NHS trusts. And I would also say that psychology is ideally suited as an interdisciplinary discipline, and it can support research in solving fundamental challenges facing our society in many different ways. Well, that's enough from me, other than once more to congratulate psychology and the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences with reaching your centenary in such a fine style. And now hand over to Professor Kamel Houston-Price, its head, to introduce Professor Alison Gopnik in an appropriate manner. Kamel, over to you.
Thank you very much, Robert. Universities are often conceived of as bastions of knowledge, and academic scholarship as the process of creating that knowledge. But as Albert Einstein pointed out, imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited, while imagination encircles the world. During this, our centenary year, we are celebrating the fruits of the imagination of Albert Wolters, the founder of the Department of Psychology at Reading. Albert Wolters came to the university in 1908 as a lecturer in the Department of Education, teaching modules in philosophy and social studies. Already at that time, however, he could see the promise of the new discipline of psychology, which had emerged as a sub-branch of philosophy in the late 19th century, led by pioneers such as William James in the United States. But in the early 20th century, the use of experimental methods to understand mental processes and human behaviour was still very much in its infancy. Albert Wolters was a leading light in introducing the scientific approach to the study of the mind to the UK. In 1910, he started teaching interested education students how to undertake practical work in experimental psychology. And soon after, the university invited him to establish a new department of psychology in 1921, one of the very first departments in the UK. His petitions to the university for suitable laboratory space, however, were not heeded. It was almost 20 years before the university gave him a room for a psychology lab, and he described this space as a very foul attic. I'm pleased to say that the research facilities we use today would not be described like that. Wolters went on to become president of the British Psychological Society from 1939 to 1941, in which capacity he helped to cement the status of psychology as a core academic discipline. So it is very much thanks to the imagination of Albert Wolters that we are now celebrating 100 years of psychology at Reading. So it is fitting that the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences has named its Distinguished Visiting Professorship Award after Albert Wolters. This award is bestowed on scholars whose imagination and vision have moved our discipline forwards in new directions. Previous recipients include Ellen Bialystok, Steven Pinker, Noam Chomsky, Elizabeth Loftus, and Daniel Dennett, each of whom has shifted the direction of intellectual inquiry in their field through their ability to imagine alternative possible explanations of the drivers of human thought and behaviour. The recipient of the Albert Wolters Distinguished Visiting Professorship in 2021 is a worthy addition to this elite lineup. Alison Gopnik is Professor of Psychology and Affiliate Professor of Philosophy at the University of California, Berkeley. She majored in Psychology and Philosophy at McGill and obtained her DPhil in Experimental Psychology at Oxford, working at the University of Toronto before joining the faculty at Berkeley. She is a member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences and a Fellow of the Cognitive Science Society. Professor Gopnik is known first and foremost for her work on children's powerful learning capacity and how this allows them to rework the initial hypotheses they bring with them into the world to successfully reason about the causes of people's behaviour and the other events they experience. In her book, The Scientist in the Crib, Alison advances the hypothesis that toddlers do not only learn through observation and imitation, but rather they are like scientists, forming ideas about the world, doing experiments to test these ideas, refining or rejecting them in the light of their experimental data. Playing and playing up both provide important opportunities to practice the scientific method. During the terrible twos, when parents tend to be the unfortunate subjects of children's experiments, it might be helpful for them to keep in mind that mess and disruption are important parts of the child's scientific endeavour. So perhaps it won't surprise you that Alison describes herself as extremely pro-baby. In her book, The Philosophical Baby, What Children's Minds Tell Us About Truth, Love and the Meaning of Life, she argues, perhaps counterintuitively, that babies and young children are actually smarter, more imaginative, more caring, and even more conscious of their environment than adults. Without the cognitive apparatus to control what they attend to, babies are trapped in the here and now, processing what is rather than what has been or what might be. And it is this openness to current experience that makes infants so good at learning, or smarter than adults. In toddlerhood, unlike adults who are kept busy with mundane activities like cooking, avoiding danger, children are free to let their minds wander in what Alison describes as the useful uselessness of immaturity. They can ask questions their parents would not conceive of, and through imaginary play, stumble on solutions that no adult could have taught them. But Professor Gopnik's work reaches beyond the domains of developmental psychology. It spans philosophy and cognitive science and has applications in fields from computing to social care. Some of her recent applied work seeks to build better artificial intelligence systems that are based on what we know about children's causal reasoning, while other work considers how caregiver skills have evolved over millennia to enable babies to learn better and faster, work that has fundamental implications for the value that society places on caregiving. I am very much looking forward to hearing about all of these ideas today. Professor Gopnik, I am delighted to award you the Albert Wolters Distinguished Visiting Professorship for 2021. And I would like to welcome you to give your presentation, which is entitled 3 Ages and 3 Intelligences, Explore, Exploit, Care. Over to you, Alison.
Well, thank you so much. I was thinking about doing this presentation, and I realized that the very first talk that I ever gave, the very first academic talk that I ever gave when I was a graduate student in Oxford in 1978 was actually at the University of Reading, and that became, I think, my very first publication. It was the child language seminar that was held at Reading, and I think probably still is held at Reading. So I have very fond, exciting memories of that time, and it's wonderful to be back. Okay, so what I'm going to do today is talk about the idea that there are actually different kinds of intelligences, different kinds of cognitive capacities at different ages. And I think quite often our picture of intelligence, our picture of cognition more generally, is that there's this kind of peak intelligence, which is, you know, sort of the 35-year-old boy genius in your department who is writing about psychology. And then development is just kind of working up to that peak, and then development after that is just falling off from that peak. And that idea doesn't make very much sense from the perspective of evolution. If it was so great to be a 35-year-old boy genius, we could all be 35-year-old boy geniuses. Instead, what I want to argue is that there are actually distinctive types of intelligence with trade-offs between them that make the intelligence of babies and young children quite different from the intelligence of adults, and in the most recent work and thinking I've been doing, different again from the intelligence of elders, of people in that last phase of development. And you can read about some of this in my books, The Gardener and the Carpenter, The Philosophical Baby, although quite a bit of this will be, I hope, in a new book that will come out when I finish writing it. So this idea is that there are multiple intelligences trading off in the course of development. And, you know, some work on intelligence sort of treats it like IQ, like it's a simple single measure. There's been more recent work discriminating between social intelligence and, say, kinesthetic intelligence, other types of intelligences. But what I want to suggest is that there are intelligences that actually are in competition with one another, that actually trade off from one another. And this is actually a set of ideas that come from work in computer science and come from computer science and to some extent from neuroscience as well. So the first kind of intelligence, which I'll just gesture to, is the one that people talk about the most, and that has the perhaps slightly mean title in computer science of being exploitation. But what that's really about is about acting in a directed, focused way to achieve the goals that you want to achieve. And, you know, you could argue, in fact, people have argued that this is the most foundational idea of intelligence. This is what actually makes intelligence work. It is the thing that lets us go out into the world, obtain resources, accomplish our goals, from an evolutionary point of view, survive and reproduce. And that kind of intelligence, that ability to actually exploit, to have a goal and achieve it, is something that people have talked about a lot in AI and in neuroscience and in psychology. But that kind of intelligence is in contrast to these two other kinds of intelligence. So one of them is the intelligence of exploration, and that's about how it is that you simply find out what the world is like, what you can do in the world, what the possibilities are in the world. And doing that, exploring widely, finding out what the structure of the world is like, finding out what you can do in that world, it's often in tension with actually acting effectively, with actually being an effective actor. And again, some of the original work on this was done in computer science, where computer scientists rapidly learned at the very beginnings of computer science that you couldn't design a system that could maximally do both of these things. So you couldn't design a system that was both maximally good at exploring and maximally good at exploiting. And what I'm going to argue, just to bit of a spoiler alert here, is that children are really involved in that exploration intelligence rather than the exploitation intelligence. But a third kind of intelligence that I've really only just recently started thinking about is what I'll call the intelligence of care/teaching. That's a little less snappy than exploitation and exploration. But this involves a kind of intelligence that involves both caring for other people and passing on information that you've already got. And one of the things that we know about human beings is one of their great strengths is their ability to have culture, the ability of one generation to altruistically pass on information to the next generation. And what I'm going to suggest is that in turn poses special computational problems, ones that have been much less explored than the other two, but ones that are particularly important for human survival. And what I'm going to suggest is there's actually a kind of symbiotic relationship between the kind of exploration that children do and the kind of care and teaching that elders in particular do. No, I think any adult is involved in all these kinds of intelligence, and part of adulthood is learning how to trade off in your everyday life these different kinds of intelligence. But what I'm going to argue is that development also is a way of resolving the trade-offs between these different kinds of intelligence. And this idea comes from an idea that's very deep foundational for evolutionary biology, but that sort of surprisingly hasn't been used as much in psychology. And this is the idea of life history. And this is a new issue of the Philosophical Transactions of the Royal Society that just came out, where we talk about how this idea of life history is related to learning, how the human developmental program shapes cognition and culture, both in us and in other animals. So if you want to read more, that's a good place to look. But let me go back to the idea of life history itself. So the idea of life history is the way that a species develops. So things like how long it lives, how long a period of childhood it has, when it has its first babies, how many babies it has. And if you can imagine a evolutionary biologist from Alpha Centauri visiting the Earth around the Pleistocene when Homo sapiens were just evolving, first of all, if she was a good evolutionary biologist, she would have known that life history is a really important factor in evolution. And the other thing is that as she looked at these little creatures scampering around on the veldt, she would not necessarily have seen really striking differences in behavior between, say, the ancestors of chimps or bonobos and the ancestors of humans. We know that chimps, for example, have some theory of mind capacities, some tool using capacities, even some cultural transmission capacities. And the great differences that we see now wouldn't have yet been in play. But what she would have noticed is the extremely strange life history of these new creatures, these Homo sapiens. Well, because if she looked, even from the time we evolved, and we actually have fossil records that show this, from the time we evolved, we had twice as long a childhood as our closest primate relatives. So this is a chimp in the Gombe, and by the time chimps are 7, they're producing as much food as they're consuming. And in forager cultures, human children aren't doing that until they're at least 15. In our culture, we might still be writing mortgage checks for our 30-some-year-old children. So we have this very long period of helpless immaturity. And then on the other end, we also have a very distinctive period of elderhood. So we have postmenopausal, in particular, we have postmenopausal grandmothers. So women, again, all the way back to the evolution of Homo sapiens, live for about 20 years past the end of their fertility. And if you compare that to our closest primate relatives, chimps, for example, lose their fertility around age 50, which is around when they die, even when they're very well taken care of. So we have a really strange life history. We have this long period of childhood, and then we have this extra 20 years at the end, this postmenopausal grandmotherhood. And again, if you might ask, well, why is it that we see this relationship between, why is it that we see this very long evolution, very strange life history happening in Homo sapiens so quickly? It seems like it's kind of paradoxical from an evolutionary perspective, because after all, that period of immaturity is a period when babies are not actually producing any food, and they have to be taken care of by us. So they're very expensive from an evolutionary perspective. And of course, the same thing's true with the extra 20 years at the end of life. You have grandmothers who are not as strong as they were when they were young and actually aren't producing babies, and yet we have an extra 20 years there too. So then there's this puzzle. Why did this happen? Why do we see this life history? And it turns out that if you look across an incredibly wide range of species, you see this striking correlation between how long a period of immaturity the young have and how much investment the older animals haven't taken care of them, and what we might anthropomorphically call intelligence, how flexible they are, how good they are at learning, and their relative brain size. So in this slide, you can see if you just compare different species of primates, for example, there's a very strong correlation between measures of intelligence and measures of weaning time. But in fact, this doesn't just apply to primates or even just to mammals. The first places that this relationship was seen was in birds. So if you compare, for example, this is a New Caledonian crow, and crows, and particularly these New Caledonian crows, are incredibly intelligent birds, as intelligent as chimps in many respects, very good at using tools. And you compare this with, say, our friend the domestic chicken. Chickens are very, very good at pecking for grain, and we know something about the computations they use to do that, which are very impressive, and are also there from the time that chickens are born. But they're not very good at doing anything else, and they're certainly not good at being able to do something like learn how to use a new tool in order to be able to solve a problem the way that the crows do. And the chickens reach maturity in about 2 weeks, as compared to the crows, who are fledglings for as long as 2 years. So we see this really striking relationship between those, the degree of sophistication and intelligence and the maturity of the animal. And it turns out that this, again, it's not just true for birds, it's true for marsupials, so it's true for quokkas and possums and kangaroos. It turns out it's even true for insects. So if you look across different species of butterflies, different groups of butterflies, the ones that are more intelligent, rely more on learning, have a longer period of immaturity. So this seems to be a very, very general relationship. And you can see this in humans. If you look at the brain as well, you see this difference between, so let me backtrack a little bit. So why would you see this? Well, the idea is that what childhood does is give you this protected period in which you can do the kind of exploration that I was talking about before. And you see this difference even when you look at neural development. You see this across primates in general, but you see it very vividly in humans, where what you see is that you have this early period. This is the number of connections, the number of synapses that are being formed. You have an early period when many, many new connections, new synapses are being formed, and then you have a kind of tipping point where the connections that have already been formed are strengthened, they're myelinated, they become more efficient, but the ones that haven't been exercised are pruned, disappear. So you have this contrast between an early brain, in particular, the baby and young childhood brain up till about age 5, that's very flexible, very plastic, as the neuroscientists say, very good at learning, very good at responding to its environment. And then this later brain that's very efficient, very good at exploitation, very good at doing things, not so good at learning or changing. And this is particularly striking for the part of the brain that's the prefrontal cortex, which is sort of the executive office of the brain that's most involved in those kind of exploit skills, which doesn't finish developing until well into adolescence. And often that's seen as being a kind of defect of babies and young children, that they don't have this kind of executive function and executive control. But if you're thinking in terms of this explore-exploit trade-off, you can see why not having that kind of control, we'll see in a minute, might actually be an advantage for things like learning and exploration. And again, let me emphasize how expensive this is. This is one of my favorite recent studies. It looked at how many calories you're using, how many calories your brain is using compared to the rest of your body. And even in adults, we use about 20% of our calories. About 20% of our calories are going to our brains. But if you look at 4-year-olds or 5-year-olds, 66% of their calories are going to their brains. So this process of developing the synapses is not just expensive because you have to take care of the kids. It's actually expensive in terms of energy. All those peanut butter sandwiches have to go in to feed those incredibly hungry brains. I also like this because it has a nice kind of so the image is that, you know, Atticus, who's my 5-year-old grandson, is basically like a Doctor Who villain. He's like this giant hungry brain perched on this little body that goes around just trying to get all of us to feed him and hypnotizes us so that we don't actually realize that we're his slaves. That's a pretty good description of your average 5-year-old. And you might ask, what is it that led to these really drastic changes in our brains in our developmental period? And the best hypothesis we have is that what happened, this speaks to the comments at the beginning, is that the environment became much less predictable. So during human evolution, it wasn't so much that, you know, now we're causing climate change, but climate change actually caused humans. And it wasn't so much that the climate got worse or better or wetter or drier, it was that it got much less predictable. It got much more variable. So actually being adapted to change, that's what we're adapted to for. Humans are adapted to the unknown unknowns. We're adapted to try to deal with really striking changes in our environment. And if you think about the explore-exploit trade-off, one of the things that is provable is that that long period of exploration becomes really important in a situation in which the environment is changing a lot, and you don't know beforehand how the environment is going to change. So as I said, there's these striking trade-offs between exploitation on the one hand and exploration on the other. And in computer science, the way that they solve those trade-offs is by having an initial period of exploration and then gradually ending up being more exploitative. So a sensible thing to do is start out exploring the space of problems that you have really widely, and then narrow in on the ones that are going to be most important, narrow in on the ones that are going to be most relevant. And in particular, in computer science, there's a concept of simulated annealing. And the idea is, think about a problem as a big box full of potential solutions, right? So there's a big box full of hypotheses or solutions to a problem, and you're at one place in this box, and your job is to search through that big space to try and find the best solution for the problem that you're facing now. Now, there's different ways that you can do that search. One way you could do that search is just look very near the place that you already are, not move very much, not change what you think very much. And that's likely to give you a good enough solution quickly. Another thing that you could do is you could bounce around the space, try out one thing, try out something completely different, try out yet another thing. And that has the disadvantage that you're less likely to get to a pretty good solution quickly, but it has the advantage that you might discover something that you wouldn't discover if you were just looking in the original space. And computer scientists use an analogy to temperature. Think about that box as if it was full of air molecules. The first kind of search is this low temperature search, and then the bouncy, noisy search is a high temperature search. So annealing is like what happens in metallurgy: heat something up first and then cool it off later. Now, I'm sure all of you who are in the audience, if you ask which one of those sounds more like your 4-year-old, right? The careful low temperature one or the noisy, bouncy one, you can already have an intuition that this is what 4-year-olds are like. But my hypothesis is that from a biological perspective, childhood is actually evolution's way of resolving this explore-exploit trade-off and performing simulated annealing. And from that perspective, many of the things that we've traditionally thought of as cognitive bugs of children, things that are evidence that children are less cognitively capable than adults, are actually features. So things like noisiness and variability and a lot of randomness, the ability to take risks, kind of immediate impulsivity, spending a lot of your time playing instead of working, and being insatiably curious. Those are all things that we think of as being characteristic of babies and young children. And they have a lot of deficits if what you want to do is like put on your jacket and get to preschool first thing in the morning, not to mention going to work and getting the resources that you need. But those are actually features from the perspective of being able to do this kind of high temperature exploration. And in fact, when you look at the general literature, what you see is that, you know, most of the time these exploit capacities, these executive function capacities, make grown-ups better than children at solving problems. So most of the time, if you give a task to children of different ages and grown-ups, the children will get better as they grow up and adults will be better than children. But there are a bunch of really distinctive examples where the opposite is true, where younger learners are actually more exploratory than older learners and adults and actually do better. And the cases where the kids do better are cases where the solution is this not obvious solution, is a solution that's unusual or different from what you would normally think. And I'm just going to have time to give you one example of, there's a bunch of work we've done in our lab that suggests this. I'm just going to have enough time to give you an example from one study that we've done. So this is a study with Emily Lequin, and a lot of our studies of causal inference have depended on this thing that we call the Blickett detector. It's a little box and it lights up and plays music when you put some things on it and not other things. So in this version of the Blickett detector, what happens is you get to decide which block you want to put on the detector on each trial. And there's something riding on this decision. So you'll get stickers depending on whether you've actually found the Blickett or not. In fact, in this one, this is actually a ZAF detector. So if you put something on and it's a ZAF, the machine will light up and you will get a sticker. But if you put it on and it's not a ZAF, then it will give you a frowny face and you'll lose 2 stickers. I give this talk a lot down in Silicon Valley to the AI guys. So I say, guys, just imagine this is like 1 billion stickers versus 2 billion stickers. All right, so now you might start already having some ideas that maybe that the color of the stripes is relevant to determining what a ZAF is. So now you've got this one, it's the same color as the first one. So you might think, okay, well, that's a ZAF, I'm going to try it. And sure enough, you get a sticker. But now here's the hard one, and I want all the people in the audience to think about it. What should you do with this one? Should you put it on the machine or not? Well, if you've already got this simple hypothesis, it's the color that makes the difference, then you should avoid this one because it's the same color as the non-ZAF. But if you aren't sure exactly what the hypothesis is, then you should put it on if you just want to find out how this machine works. And it turns out that if you avoid it, so the kind of rational thing to do would be to avoid it. And remember, you lose more when you're wrong than you gain when you're right. But in this particular machine, it actually works on a different principle. So the actual outcome is that if you put the dotted one on, then it would actually work. So in fact, the principle is not this simple one-dimensional color principle, but it depends on the combination of the color and the texture, the color and the shape of the dots. Okay, hopefully everyone gets this. Well, it turns out that if you do this kind of experiment with grown-ups, what happens is that they get stuck in what psychologists call a learning trap. So what happens is, just as you might imagine, as soon as they see a couple of examples of the ZAFs that don't work, the things that aren't ZAFs, then they start avoiding them because they don't want to lose stickers. And the result is that they never learn this more complicated rule that would actually allow them to get more stickers in the long run. So what we did is we had 4 sets of these blocks, like the ones we saw. Obviously, we counterbalanced the colors and the shapes. And on each trial, the participant can either decide to approach it or decide to avoid it. And just as the previous literature had shown, we showed that adults tended to avoid the blocks, and they avoided them more as time went on. But the result of this was that they missed about half of the potential reward, half of the potential positive blocks. When we looked at 6- and 7-year-olds, they were more likely to approach even when the other block was there. And as you might imagine, 4-year-olds and 5-year-olds loved putting the blocks on, and they would just put the blocks, their faces would fall as they would lose stickers, but they'd still put on the next block. But more interestingly, what happened in terms of learning? So what we tried to see is, do participants get the wrong rule, that one-dimensional rule, or are they actually learning the more unusual, more complicated, but correct rule, the 2-dimensional rule? And what we saw was that grown-ups fall into the learning trap. The grown-ups are sticking with that initial rule, the thing that they thought was true when they started, and not using the data to learn the new rule. And in fact, the younger children, the 6- and 7-year-olds, are a bit better than the adults, and the youngest children are actually the best of all at solving this problem. So here's an example where, when the environment is different than you might think to begin with, when it's got this kind of weird 2-dimensional feature, being this explorer, going out into the world and finding out about things, actually can help you to learn. And as I say, we have a whole bunch of other findings that are like this. But now, so all of this suggests that children are designed to have this this capacity to explore, to find out about the world. But that capacity to explore fundamentally depends on having someone who's taking care of you during your exploration. And this is very vividly shown in another study, which I wish was from our lab, but is actually from Nim Tottenham's. This is a study that just came out in Nature Human Behavior. And she had another nice example of the children being more exploratory than the adults, which actually comes from the animal literature. So if you think about the history of psychology, appropriately in this 100 years, one of the very, very first findings, way back in the 1920s, is Watson's finding that rats will engage in avoidance learning. So really classic, you put the rat in a T-maze, it goes down one arm, it gets a shock, it goes down the other arm, nothing happens. Now you put the rat back in the maze and it won't go down the arm that had the shock. And that's a really basic foundational kind of exploit learning. But you should already be thinking that kind of learning has a disadvantage. It kind of puts you in a learning trap, which is that if you never go down that arm again, then you're never going to find out if the environment has changed. Maybe there isn't a shock at that end of the arm. Maybe there's actually a reward. Maybe there's more food if you do that. And it's from a clinical perspective, a lot of clinical disorders like anxiety disorders and phobias seem to really be because what happens is, you know, you get on the plane once and you have a miserable time and then you refuse to get on the plane again, and that just exaggerates your sense of fear and anxiety. And the more you avoid the negative outcome, the more anxious you get. So for instance, when people are treating phobias, the way to treat a phobia is to force yourself to be exposed to the thing that you're phobically scared of. Now, it turns out that this is true about adult rats, but it's not actually true about young rats. So if you look at juvenile rats, they actually will prefer to go down the arm that leads to the shock, rather surprisingly. But there's an interesting twist. They'll only do that if their mother is present. So if the mother is absent, just like the adult rats, they'll avoid the negative reward. But if the mother is present, they'll actually prefer the choice that gives them more information, but also involves some risk. And again, if you have teenagers, you can sort of see how this goes. So in rats, the young rats are willing to take the risk to get information, and the older rats aren't, but they only do it if a parent is present. And what Nim did was show that the same thing is true with 4 and 5-year-old children. So she set up a very similar experiment, except now it's a blast of unpleasant noise. And literally, you know, it's like a maze. There's 2 corridors and there's a signal on it. And what she discovered was that 3 and 4-year-old children, 4 and 5-year-old children were the same way. If they experienced the information with a parent, they were more willing to take risks than if they had experienced it alone. So it seems as if having the parent there, whether you're a rat or a child, is a kind of signal that says, okay, it's okay to explore. I'm going to make sure that nothing really terrible happens to you. You can just get information about what's going on around you. So having childhood depends on having more caregivers. And this is a summary of a piece in Eon that I've done about this. Sure enough, if you look at human evolution, one of the things that you see is at the same time that we evolved this very long period of childhood, we also evolved what I think of as the investment triple threat. So if you look at, again, our closest primate relatives, chimps, for example, basically biological mothers are doing almost all of the childcare for baby chimps in that period of immaturity. But as soon as we evolved, humans had pair bonding, for example, which is very rare among mammals, where fathers as well as mothers were taking care of babies, and fathers and mothers were bonded to one another, were close to one another. And that seems to be a way of adding to that kind of investment. That is, by the way, my father and my son and my grandson. We also had alloparents, and here the great anthropologist Sarah Hrdy has talked the most about this. People who were not kin to children who were nevertheless involved in caring for them. In fact, there's an interesting recent study by Barry Hewlett, who was looking at one of these forager groups, and he looked at how many moms breastfed each of the babies. And it turns out that on average over a week, babies in these cultures would be breastfed by 4 different women. So people are very willing in a forager context to be involved and engaged in taking care of babies. And this includes older siblings, cousins, but also people who aren't biologically kin to the babies they're taking care of at all. And then my personal favorite, we have these postmenopausal grandmothers that I mentioned, this extra 20 years of life. And if you look at this picture, you can see that lurking behind these 3 beautiful grandchildren is a grandmother. I originally took this picture because I think it's a lovely picture. But then I realized that actually this picture is saying something else about grandmothers. So what's actually happening in this picture is that I'm reading first edition of A.A. Milne's when we were very young, the poems in that very old book, to my grandchildren. And I love old children's books, and the children love having the special old children's book. But what that means is that I'm actually passing on more than 100 years of culture and tradition onto the children in the act of reading them this book. And as I said, one of the things that we know about humans that's also a sort of distinctive ability that we have is this ability we have to pass on information from one generation to the next. And grandmothers and grandfathers in general, grandparents, are in a particularly good position to pass on information across generations. And again, the anthropologist Kristen Hawkes has argued that it was actually the contribution of grandmothers that enabled human beings to have this long extended period of childhood. So she's shown with very careful studies that in these forager cultures, the grandmothers are actually providing the calories that keep the babies going. And in fact, what happens is that in the first year or two babies are nursing, human mothers are also having babies more frequently than primate mothers are. So the toddler baby, the one who's still dependent on the mother but isn't nursing anymore, is being weaned, that's really where the grandmothers come in. So the status of the infants really depends on the mothers, but how well the toddlers do really depends on the grandmothers, and depends on how much the grandmothers are supporting them and giving them food. But I think in addition to that simple resources that grandmothers are providing, they're providing really important cultural resources as well. And some of the evidence for this actually comes from, rather surprisingly, from orcas. So if you look, as I mentioned, if you look across different kinds of species, this postmenopausal grandmotherhood is extremely rare. It's very unusual. In fact, we only know of one group of animals, aside from us, that has this postmenopausal grandmotherhood. And they're whales, in particular, these orcas. And when I gave this talk for a while, I would always say, okay, so it's very unusual. It's us and orcas. Orcas, like, go figure, why orcas? And it turns out that orcas are also among the and this is something that we've really only discovered in the last 5 or 6 years or so. It turns out that orcas are actually also among the few animals that have really strong cultural traditions. So what happens is that the orca grandmothers, the way the orcas' lives are organized is that there's a kind of family pod where the grandmothers and the sons and the grandchildren are all in the same group. And especially when things change, when resources are scarce, the grandmothers actually will lead the pod out to find new resources, or in fact, to find old resources. So what happens is the grandmothers have been foraging, they have an idea of where the resources are available over a long period of time, and they seem to be able to use that information, pass that information on to the young, especially when things have changed or things look difficult or resources are scarce. And in fact, it turns out that orcas have, these orca pods have food traditions. So you'll get a pod that will just eat krill, or another pod that will just eat salmon, to the point where if you offer them the other kind of food, they just will turn up their noses at it. I also like this as a description of what grandmothers are doing. So it's sort of my own son has started a Montreal Jewish deli in Berkeley where he passes on poutine and Montreal smoked meat. So I feel as if I've really done my job as a grandmother by passing on those traditions the same way the orcas do. Okay, and it turns out that if you look at humans in the context of forager culture, for example, this is really beautiful work that Michael Gervin has done. This kind of teaching capacity is something that you see particularly in the elders. So in that special issue of Philosophical Transactions that I mentioned, he has a really beautiful analysis of many, many, many cultures that rely on hunting. And hunting, of course, is a very difficult skill. You don't really get to be maximally good at it until your 30s. And what he did was look at the age composition of hunting parties. Now, again, something that will be very vivid for anyone who's gone through COVID is that part of the trouble with this wonderful teaching and cultural transmission piece is that it's twice as hard to do something if you have a bunch of kids around who are also trying to learn how to do it. So our particular sad COVID story was that we were making pancakes every Sunday, which is what we always did with the grandchildren, but making them by ourselves. And one of the things that was pretty striking was how much faster it is to make pancakes when you don't have 3 grandchildren around. Our grandchildren were here this weekend making pancakes, and I remembered suddenly, oh my God, this takes so much longer, and it's so much messier when you're trying to do it with a 5-year-old. But that, it turns out, is true, especially true for, pancakes might not matter so much, but when you have a hunting party, how effective you are at doing it is really important. And what ends up happening is that the prime of life exploitive hunters go out by themselves to hunt, but then the older hunters have more knowledge, even though they're not as strong or as capable, and they're the perfect people to actually teach the kids. So you get the elders who know a lot, aren't quite as effective at actually implementing it, will go out and pass that knowledge on to children. And the trade-off is that even if you're not producing as much, you're doing this very important thing of passing on the knowledge of hunting to this next generation of children, who in turn can become the adult exploiters. And there's evidence from Gervin and also from another great anthropologist, Polly Wiesner, that not only are the elders passing on some of these specific skills, like being able to hunt, but they're also passing on especially some of the big features of the culture, some of the grand features, some of the things that they think are the most important, most abstract things to understand. And Polly Wiesner has these beautiful studies looking at the conversations that people are producing during the day. And she, again, did very careful studies saying, what is it, if you have more than 5 people together, what are they talking about? And what she discovered was that during the day, the conversations were very much dominated by the adults, the regular adults, and they were about work, about coordinating work. And I find this slightly comforting. About 2/3 of them were what she called CCC, which was complaint, criticism, and conflict. So basically, most of the time during the day, when you're talking, you're complaining about, you're sort of, half of it is coordinating work that you do with others, and half of it is complaining about the fact that nobody else is really doing what you want them to do. So now when I come home from a hard day, I tell my husband, oh, it was only 66% CCC. It was actually, I should actually think of it as being a good day. But then at night, the conversations really shifted. So at night, sitting around the fire, not actually being able to do the everyday work, that was when the elders started taking over the conversation. And as you can see, the elders are there with the children. And now the elders aren't just talking about the everyday, they're talking about the myths and the songs and the things that are happening far away in time or far away in space. And that's when the children are learning some of these big principles about how their environment or their culture, works. And again, Gervin found that if you ask people, where did you learn that song or where did you hear that story? Very often in these cultures, they'd say it was the grandparents or the older people who had taught them the song rather than their own parents. So, we give old wives' tales a bad rap, but the point here is that the old wives' tales are often full of wisdom. And I think that's even true in a contemporary interaction between grandparents and children. The grandparents love telling stories, especially stories about when they were young, and the children love hearing those stories and songs from the grandparents. So this raises a whole question about what kind of intelligence does it take to be able to do this, to be able to care, to be able to pass on cultural information. And it turns out that this is actually, so suppose you kind of go back being a computer scientist and you say, how does this happen? It turns out that this is actually a really challenging problem for computer science. And I highly recommend this beautiful story from the science fiction writer Ted Chiang, which is about imagining what it would be like to actually have childlike AI systems that you would have to raise, that you would have to integrate. And interestingly, the big revolution in AI has been designing AI systems that can learn for themselves rather than ones where cognition and knowledge are programmed in. And if you have a system that learns, you face all of these kinds of issues of care. So, for example, one of the big questions that everyone worries about in AI is called the alignment problem, is how do you get an AI that has the right values? So what we can do now is if we give the AI a problem to solve or a value to maximize, kind of in exploit fashion, so we say to them, okay, we want you to get the best possible score you could get in this Atari game, they'll be able to do that. But what they can't do is say, you know, maybe this isn't really the goal that I should have. Maybe this goal is leading to bad outcomes. Maybe I should change the goal that I have. And I think a really important central thing that we do when we care, especially when we care for children, but when we care for people in general, is that we have to figure out, we have to give them information that lets them make new goals for themselves. So when we're caring for a child, we aren't just giving them goals or outcomes or getting them, training them to be as good as they possibly can be. What we want to do is give them enough autonomy so that they can make their own goals. And in my book, The Gardener and the Carpenter, I suggest this kind of gardener and carpenter contrast. What you need to do as a parent is to make a nurturing environment in which children can take risks, in which children can find things out and decide things for themselves. And one way of thinking about this kind of distinctive intelligence of care is that it's very different from the social contract. So if you look at all of the literature about cooperation, the evolution of cooperation, the biology of cooperation, the psychology of cooperation, the kinds of things that you see in political science, in political philosophy, in moral psychology, in the very foundational heart of economics, the picture of how human beings function is this picture of the social contract. So the idea is, well, we cooperate because I do something for you and then you do something for me. And if we trade off, I'll do this thing and you do that thing, in the long run, we all end up being better off than if we had just tried to maximize our own individual resources. So you have this sort of picture, you've got a whole bunch of exploiters, you've got a whole society of people trying to maximize their utilities and their goals, and they manage to cooperate by trading off what one person wants and what another person wants. But that's not what caregiving is like at all, right? That's not a good model for caregiving. The whole point about caregiving is that it's asymmetric. The whole point about caregiving, the whole point about having a baby is not that you're taking care of the baby because if the baby, the baby agrees to take care of you. It's that the baby's goals actually become your goals. In fact, they become more important than your goals. So the goals and objectives of the person that you're caring for actually are, yourself is extended to include that person that you're caring for, most notably if you're thinking about babies, but also if you're taking care of an elderly person, you're taking care of someone who's ill, or you're just taking care of a partner, taking care of a friend. What you do is say, all right, how can I help this person to accomplish their goals, not what do I have to do to accomplish my goals through my relationship with this person. And I think from a political perspective, you could think about the great inventions of the Enlightenment, like markets and states, as devices that let us scale up the social contract. So now I can use a market to determine for hundreds of millions of people how do we balance all the things that they want, or we can do the same thing with states and governments. And I think one of the real challenges is that it's much harder to do that if you're thinking about these caring relationships between individuals. And in fact, in the latest issue of The Economist, I have a piece about what we should do or what we could do to actually support these relationships of care. Because I think one thing that's happened is, because we have this sort of social contract picture, and because we have these mechanisms that come out of the social contract picture, like markets and the state, we have a very, very hard time taking care seriously. It doesn't caring, the kind of caring that parents do or grandparents do doesn't even show up in the GDP. We don't have good ways of doing it. When we do support care, we kind of pretend that we aren't. So we support preschool instead of, as long as we call it preschool, we're willing to support it, but not if it's childcare. We treat, in America especially, the Social Security as a kind of insurance rather than a way of actually caring for elderly people, and so forth. And I think COVID has really made both the essential importance of caregiving and the extent to which we don't support it, we don't take it seriously. I think it's made both of those things really vivid. And part of what I just very briefly outlined in that piece, and what I'm trying to work on, think about now, is some of the things that we could actually do, some of the policies we could have that would enable us to support this kind of care that we know is so essential and crucial from an evolutionary perspective. So some of the ideas are to have things like better child allowances and family allowances, parental leaves. Of course, these are all things that relatively civilized countries like the UK have that we don't have in the United States. But even in the UK, for example, we could imagine taking the model of child allowances and extending it to elder allowances, so that you could have a designated carer, for example, the one person, usually the daughter, who's taking care of the elderly parents, and then she could be the designated carer. She gets 6 months to a year time off, and she gets enough funding so that she can do the role of taking care of those, taking care of the elderly people who need to be cared for. I think marriage is interesting because it's one of the very few examples we have of a policy that's actually, of a policy that actually does legally recognize these relationships of care. But again, it's funny that the only one that we recognize, which is the sexual relationship between two partners, probably not the most stable basis for care. That's really the only one that we recognize legally. And you could imagine extending the model of marriage again to include someone who cares for an elderly person, or to have the role that godparents and alloparents had, so that you could officially be involved and engaged in caring for a child. Our built environment is terrible in terms of the way that it separates elders and children. And I think, again, we're starting to recognize that more and more. It was something that became very vivid in COVID. So we have the children in one place, we have the parents in another place, and we have the elders in yet another place with long commutes that you have to do to get from one to another. And again, I think one of the things that COVID has taught us is that we could have nurture and work and childhood and families all in the same place, and that would be a kind of model that was much more like the model of the Pleistocene. And a last suggestion that I like is the idea of having a grandparent corps. So as you, for example, expand preschools, one of the questions and problems is, how could we get people in to take care of all of those very young children? And the idea would be that every preschool class could have a designated grandparent who's not the BA in early childhood education, is just the abuela, the grandmother, who will tell stories and do the kinds of things that grandparents do. And I think we have good reason to believe that would be extremely healthy, both for the grandparents and for both for the elders and for the children. All right, so let me end by saying, in some ways, these ideas are not so new. This is actually, again, appropriate for this 100-year event. This is actually a piece of film that we just recently found from 100 years ago from the Berkeley Child Studies Center Early Development Program. It was one of the first early childhood education programs in the country in the 1920s. And these are, I find this incredibly touching. These are children who probably aren't around anymore in that very early program. And what you can see is that these programs, these early preschools, did all the things that we would talk about. They had caring adults, they had children who could explore the physical world, could explore the psychological world, could explore animals. And I think that's the model that we really need to have if we want to take advantage of our marvelous human life history. So why don't I end there and see if there are questions?
Alison, thank you.
Yeah, should I stop sharing at this point, Carmel?
Yes, do you want to stop sharing so we can see you more easily?
Right.
Thank you for that fascinating presentation, wide-ranging and thought-provoking. And, you know, it's a shame that you can't hear the round of applause, but I know it's happening. It's just not possible to hear it on Teams Live. But thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. I can see that there are questions coming in, and I'm going to be picking some of those and putting them to you. But perhaps I'd like to invite the Vice-Chancellor to ask the first question. Thank you, Robert.
Thanks, Carmel, and thanks, Alison. Yes, it is a fascinating lecture. There are quite a few questions I would like to ask, and towards the end you threw in this whole issue about caregiving and why we are actually so bad at recognizing the role. But I want to go back to something, you know, as a Vice-Chancellor, I look after lots of different disciplines, and the one thing that struck me really is how you have those three components of learning, and whether or not you can take from there, what is the best time to introduce formal learning in the child's process. And there are lots of discussions in the Western world. I come from a slightly different background. In Holland, you know, the whole idea of learning to read before you're 6 is considered to be ridiculous. And here, if you can't read by the age of 6, you're a problem child. So is there something from your research coming out? But what is the best way of structuring formal learning into a child's process to get the best outcome?
Right, exactly. So I think one of the reasons why I like that film is because I think we have very good models, and you know, they have various names like the Reggio Emilia programs or Montessori programs, and each of them has their own particular ideas, but I think we have really good models for how to support this kind of exploration. They're sort of institutionalized forms of what would have happened in the Pleistocene. Children are running around, they're exploring, there are grown-ups who are sort of paying attention to them. And they're very, very different from the model we have of school. And I think, I haven't talked about this in the talk, but I think there's a natural transition at about 6 or 7, where children are moving from this kind of broad exploration to something more like an apprenticeship. That's when, you know, 6 or 7 is when the kids are actually going out with the elders and hunting and starting to actually learn some of these useful skills. And I think it's a terrible disaster that the only way that we can get support for childcare is by saying, okay, we're just going to do school because we know that we're going to support school. So we'll make preschools more and more like schools. And that's something that's happening everywhere. Whereas I think the data exactly suggests that if anything, what we should be doing is making schools more like preschools. So at least until 6 or 7, we should be having these kind of preschool models. And as you say, we've got very good evidence from places like Finland that then the children do very well when they actually get into school. I should add, I was on a panel at Davos with the Chancellor of Oxford, and I was talking about this, and I said, you know, I was a graduate student in Oxford, and I said, Oxford's really was kind of like a big preschool. That was why it was such a wonderful graduate experience, much more than American universities are. We just kind of, you know, talked and played around and did things in the lab. And I looked at the Chancellor rather nervously, and he said, oh yeah, that's great. That's exactly right. And I think that's true. Universities are an example of an institution that we have as adults that is designed to give us this period of exploration. And that's kind of the point. That's why universities are so useful. And that goes with innovation. So if you want innovation, you need to have a protected space in which you can explore.
So I'm going to start picking up some questions from the chat now. Following a similar theme, but going back perhaps to earlier childhood, there are a few questions around the extent to which children are given the opportunity to explore that they apparently need and want. And given more risk-averse parenting these days, you know, is there a risk that children aren't getting the opportunities? And, you know, are there going to be kind of consequential difficulties from that if they don't have these opportunities when they come to deal with uncertainty in later life?
Right. So children are extremely, I'm always a bit hesitant to say, you know, this is what the consequence of this particular environment is going to be, because children are very resilient and they can deal with lots of different caregiving techniques. And my suspicion is most of the things that parents actually are consciously trying to decide about aren't going to make very much difference. But having said that, it is absolutely striking and widely, crazily irrational that at a time when children are safer than they've ever been before, parents are more risk averse than they've ever been before. And you see this again, especially in America, but you certainly see it in England as well. And it's a little hard to figure out why parents are like this. It doesn't seem to be rational at all. It's not really making the children safer. And I suspect that the incidence of anxiety that we see increasing is connected to that lack of risk taking. So if you go back to the rats in the mazes, that's the model for anxiety, is that so imagine that mom rat, instead of saying, yeah, it's fine, don't worry, nothing will happen to you. Imagine if that mother rat is saying, no, don't go down the corridor, don't go down that corridor. There could be something bad at the end of the corridor. That's a recipe for inducing exploration and lack of risk taking. Now, as I say, I don't think we have enough evidence to really show that that's the link. There's all sorts of other things that have changed, but I suspect that that's at least part of the story. And it's interesting, I just did a column about this. On the flip side, if you look at the effects of preschool, one of the really fascinating study that just came out looking at the effects of preschool, what people thought was that the way that preschool was going to help children was it would give them these preschool, it would give them these school-age skills at a younger age, and then they'd do better at school, and then they'd do better in high school, and so forth. And it turns out that that's not the way it looks at all. What happens is you have this recent study had a kind of randomized, informal randomized control trial where half of the kids in Boston got Boston had a high quality preschool program, but they didn't have enough slots, so you ended up with the equivalent of a randomized control trial. When you looked at second and third grade, not any difference in scores, not any difference in the way the kids were doing. But when you looked at whether they went to college or not, or whether they took the SATs to get into college, or in other studies, whether people end up having a better health or higher incomes or going to prison or not, those were all the things that preschool was determining. So I think the picture is, it's not that preschool is giving you these school-age skills, it's that preschool is exactly, as in the beautiful film, these high-quality preschools are giving you a safe, protected space in which you can play and explore, and that gives you a kind of resilience and an ability to deal with change, which has these long-term effects.
Thank you, that was great. Turning to adulthood then, the second phase in your 3 ages, what about the adult's more cautious, risk-averse, conservative approach? Is this holding us back at all? Would we be better off if we were like young children, more exploratory, given the uncertain world we live in increasingly? And are there ways to cultivate that kind of exploratory behaviour in adulthood, or is that not what we should be doing?
Well, as you were saying, Carmel, I am very pro-team baby, so I always feel like I'm both psychologically and politically on the team of those wonderful exploratory poetic babies. But the truth is, like, you would not want one to be your head of school or your vice chancellor, right? You know, we look down our noses a bit at those, you know, practical, let's get this done, how are we going to achieve this? But those are the things that actually keep us alive, right? Including keeping those babies alive. So those skills and teaching children those skills, which I think is what happens in this kind of 7 to adolescent period, that's really, I mean, not just important, that's crucial. We wouldn't be able to survive without it. I think the challenge for adults is, how do we actually manage to have all 3 of those pieces, the exploit piece, the explore piece, and the care and teaching piece, in an adult life? So what I don't want to argue that all adults do is try to, you know, get the maximum benefit for their goals. Although I do think that these developmental periods of childhood and elderhood are particularly designed to accomplish these ends. But I think adults have different kinds of ways that they can balance these. So having a kind of division of labor. So, you know, a university is a place where, as I say, it's not that the children are little scientists, it's that scientists are big children. So a university is a place that puts an emphasis on exploration. In companies, there's a reason why the research and research and development division is separate from marketing because they're doing really, really different kinds of things. So I think you want to have, and then yet again, we need to have, it's funny, they always disappear. We don't really have a caring division, even though that's something else that we crucially need to be able to succeed. So I think for adults, we can have this division of labor, or we can have different contexts. So one of the things I like about the Polly Wisner story is, okay, in the daytime you exploit, but in the evening around the fire, that's when you tell stories and you explore and you teach. You go on a meditation retreat, which is not where you're actually focusing on what it is that, and in fact, it's interesting, like it's intentionally don't focus on all the things that you need to get done, just open yourself up to experience. So I think there are ways that human adults have done this, but I will continue to aver that that basically we're most human up to puberty and after menopause. And in between, we're sort of glorified primates who are running around and making our way in the pecking order and mating and producing and doing those things. But those are all things that we all have to do. So.
And that really leads really nicely to, there's a follow-up question. So someone's suggesting in the chat that the reason why, or asking the question, is the reason why adults perhaps enjoy drinking alcohol so much, that it reduces the control of the prefrontal cortex, allows us to experience more childlike behavior, you know, and perhaps when we're interacting with other people socially, so around the campfire at night, we can actually behave more in a more childlike way. And is that part of the appeal of alcohol?
Yeah, it's fun. There's a book that's just come out by Edward Slingerland that I've talked to him about alcohol in that context. And I think there's quite a bit of evidence that loosening this prefrontal control actually allows for greater exploration. There's a whole neuroscience argument, even studies that show that, you know, zapping your prefrontal lobes so they're not working as well lets you do better on various kinds of creativity measures. And as I say, I think we do a lot of things, a lot of our activities that might seem strange, including alcohol, but also including things like ecstatic dancing or being in a mystical state, or there's fascinating work going on now about the effects of psychedelics, where I think that there's a good argument to be made that the positive effects of things like mescaline or ayahuasca come because they put your brain, I mean, literally put your brain back into a state that's much more like that childhood high exploration state. That's even the principal theory about how psychedelics work, is that they put your brain in a high entropy state, that kind of high temperature state. So I think there are a lot of things that we do as adults that are even just sort of physically putting us into a state that's more like children. And one of the interesting side notes about this is that I think that can give us some nice insight into what it's like to be a child. So I think that kind of numinous state is what people in religion call it, that state of being very, very open to everything that's going on around you, that we adults really have to, you know, we get little glimpses of that at particular moments or in, say, religious or spiritual contexts. I think for children, that's the state that they're in quite a lot of the time. That's the state that comes with that exploratory brain.
Thank you. So there's a question about how flexible the trade-off is between these three intelligences. So is the balance between these intelligences largely fixed at a particular life stage, or is it more dynamic in certain age groups?
Yeah, so I think the truth is your 3-year-old is not going to be good at executive function no matter what you do, right? So I think if you are especially thinking about infants and the preschoolers, who are kind of my favorite age, the 18 months to 5 or 6, I mean, they really are exploring. That's what they do, and that's what they're all about. Now, it has to be said, they're starting to get some of the ideas about exploitation and care. They're starting to be more competent. And when you get to the 7 or 8-year-old, in most cultures, 7 and 8-year-olds are already very deeply engaged in caring for younger SIPs, for example. They're the allo parents. So a 7 or 8-year-old is already learning how to exploit, learning how to be competent, learning how to be skilled, and I think very importantly, learning how to care. I think one of the real difficulties we have in our current society is we have, you know, parents who are 30 or 40 who've never actually taken care of a baby before they have a baby themselves. That's a bizarre thing from the perspective of of life in general. And again, it may be part of the reason why our caregiving is so sort of invisible and undervalued and overlooked. So I think that kind of transition around 6 or 7, you start getting children moving into both exploitation and care. And then I think for adults, there's this kind of social question about how do you manage to, both in individuals and I think especially across societies, how do you manage to have these different kinds of functions? And then of course, we have 78-year-old presidents, we have, or 66-year-old women giving lectures for the Albert Wolters professorship. So we elders are still capable of doing some functional things, but again, I think we undervalue. And in fact, I think even as say a faculty member, it's striking to me how different one's role is at 66 than at 20 when I gave that first talk in Reading. How much your role really, which is can be kind of depressing when you hear the old voice saying, wait a minute, honey, we did this study and you don't know about in 1967, and tell the AI guys, no, wait a minute, that idea, people tried it in with the AI guys, of course, it's, yeah, they tried that in 2016, which seems so long ago that they can't believe that anyone could actually be that old. But I think that's true even in our adult lives.
Thank you. One final question. Given the experiences that we've all been through over the last year or year and a half, there's a question about how might these experiences during lockdown particularly, so parents spending a lot more time at home with their children, homeschooling, some parents, as you say, hadn't really raised their children before this and suddenly they have to. How might this be affecting that symbiotic relationship between parents and children and how children learn?
Yeah. So I think the series that I just did this piece in The Economist in is called Lessons from Lockdown, and it was trying to think about what could we say about what we'd learned through COVID. So I think on the one hand, it meant that children had fewer opportunities to explore, and I think especially for adolescents and teenagers, that's been really challenging. On the other hand, I do think it's made everyone realize how crucial care is and how hard care is. So there was a kind of chorus of high achieving dads who were now staying home with their kids who were saying, oh God, I really appreciate my kid's teacher. I didn't realize how incredibly hard it is to be a third grade teacher. Gee, that's a lot harder than any of the CEO job that I've got, right? So I think some of it was that having that ability to care. But on the other hand, it also made us realize, wait a minute, if you lose grandmothers, you've really lost something, that the broader community was really important. But I'm hoping that the consequence of that, and it's interesting, you can see evidently lots of people sort of moved home so they could be with their families and have their families involved in caregiving, and realized, oh well, you could do a lot of jobs and be in the place that you grew up with your family. And I hope that's something that we'll take going forward, that people will say, oh no, wait a minute, you can have an entire family involved and engaged in caring for children in the same place, and that's a really positive, that would be a really positive outcome.
It's great to know there's another positive outcome of bringing families together, so that's really positive. Thank you, Alison. It just remains for me to say thank you very much. That was a fascinating presentation. Really enjoyed it very much indeed. I'll hand over to the Vice-Chancellor to close this evening's session.
Thank you, Carmel. I think that was a memorable public lecture in this series that the Albert Wolters Distinguished Visiting Professor given over the last 3 years. So thank you very much, Alison. It was a fascinating talk. There is always food for thought, isn't it? We take so much for granted in our lives. And every time when you come to a lecture, there are things that are touching upon fundamental matters. How do we learn? How do we teach? How do we find the right balance? It is essential to what we do here at the University of Reading, but it is essential what we do in society. And thank you for giving us those insights. I would say to all the attendees and members of the public who have been with us tonight, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed it too. There are more events this week, and as I said, go to the website of the psychology department, and you'll find the other events. I hope you'll enjoy them too. But for now, I will just thank you once more all for attending. Happy birthday to the School of Psychology and Clinical Language Sciences, and hope to see you in the future. Goodbye.
That's great. Thank you all so much for coming.